The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Kia ora, ni hao, welcome back to 10200, your New Zealand politics, media, society podcast. You're here with your three favorite co-hosts now that Kyle's down. We have me, my name's Philip. Thanks for joining us. We also have Stephanie. How are you?
Kia ora, I'm confused about your phrasing. Does that mean if Kyle's not here, we're the top three, or does that mean we're kicking Kyle out of the top three? Important distinction that needs to be made clear over the course of the next however many minutes.
I think it's deliberately ambiguous for legal reasons, which is potentially an issue we'll get into later on in the podcast about a different fun topic. We also have Simone. How are you, Simone?
I'm well. I like that we've added society to this. We're taking on even more roles at 1 of 200. And you know what? I'm gonna say it. Get fucked, Jack. I'm never running for anything.
Got him.
Zing!
Zing! Beautiful. Delightful. Well, welcome back. What a week it's been. Gorgeous. A gorgeous week in New Zealand politics chaos, as always. We're going to focus more on local stuff today. There's plenty of current events going around in the New Zealand politics sphere without getting too overseas or too whiffly-waffly. But let's see if we can add something to the discourse. To start with, there's been an interesting turn in the last week where first Winston Peters of Winston First, New Zealand First, said that New Zealand First would campaign on repealing the RSB, or RSA, I guess we should say now, Regulatory Standards Law Change.
I was going to say the Returned Servicemen's
Returned
Association?
Services Association,
That would be a
yeah.
bold move from Winston.
And a deep attack on his base. No, the Regulatory Standards Bill that has only just passed. So, I mean, sure, Winston always does this, right? He always campaigns against some things that he did while he was in government. That's sort of part of the nature of the beast of MMP. You can't be for everything that happened. Otherwise, who's going to vote for you? You need something to have, something to change. But a week is a short time in politics. In this example, that is wild. And the fact that they were seemingly, genuinely singing the praises of this kind of reactionary piece of lawmaking, and then the next week said, oh no, this is actually anti-democratic. That's not how democracy should work. Pretty fundamental kind of critiques of a piece of law that their own MP had been, I want to say, fervently singing the praises of literally 1 week beforehand has got to be breaking some kind of land speed record in terms of Winston, heaving on the handbrake and skidding around, not just to slow the car down, but to fire it in the opposite direction as fast as possible. Impressive driving skills from Winston, the rally driver. Stephanie, did you have thoughts about this kind of switch up?
Well, I'd more seen it from the perspective of Nicola Willis then jumping on to be like, oh yeah, us too, we could totally work together. As you say, it's not unusual for Winston to go into an election campaigning against a thing he just did, but normally he pretends not to know he just did it. Normally it's been with things like gender affirming policies or relationship and sexuality education. He kind of pretends he wasn't in the room, or Labour didn't tell him, or he was tricked. But now it's just like, yeah, we voted for that, but now we wouldn't. If that would help you vote for us, we would not vote for it. For me, the more interesting flip of it is Nicola Willis jumping onto it, because this is just a pattern of all-term national, basically saying, we didn't want to do this, but David Seymour made us. And that is a terrible, terrible communication strategy, because there's nothing more pathetic you can say in the English language than David Seymour made me do it. And particularly for the National Party, whose politics are so built on like strength and might is right, and we're powerful because we deserve to have power, to constantly be saying, actually, we're very weak, we're very helpless, we actually have no choice in anything we're doing, David Seymour made us. It's a really bold approach, ironically, to take into election campaign, basically saying, vote for us and we'll do whatever David Seymour isn't campaigning on, because none of it will come up before the actual election.
And we'd previously had the interview with, I think it was Nicola Willis as well, right? When she was asked what would a government that had just been national do differently, essentially, right? From the current government. And she said, I think we'd see less focus on issues affecting Māori or something like that, which pointedly isn't saying different laws. There might be less emphasis on those laws in the media because of the kinds of rhetoric and attack strategies from the minor parties needing to carve off their own more explicitly racist kind of attack lines. But yeah, interesting to say, you know, let's focus on rather than different outcomes legally, potentially, right? And yeah, the fact that she's even leaving the door open to do the same kind of flip that Winston Peters was talking about says something really interesting about the state of MMP in New Zealand and the kind of cynicism around it, right? There's just seems to be this like built-in expectation that, or increasingly so, I suppose it's fair to say, that parties are just going to lie about what they support and what they don't support. If the National Party didn't want to pass the Regulatory Standards Bill, they didn't have to, obviously, but B, if they thought they had to in order to form government with David Seymour, if that's a cost of government that they've decided they're willing to bear, then say that. Don't say it's a good piece of lawmaking and this shows how strong and stable we are. It shows the opposite of that. It shows how unstable your coalition is.
Yeah, I think in the 2017 to 2020 term, we did see this several times with the Green Party voting for things that they did not agree with on the basis that, and I know that there's still to this day a lot of arguments about this, but on the basis that the cooperation agreement with Labour meant they had to support certain policies that were committed to in the coalition agreement with New Zealand First. But you never saw the Greens standing up there going, we think this is great. We think this is a perfect piece of legislation and we fully endorse it, and then going, oh, we hate it. There was always very careful messaging around, we are voting for this because we are required to. And somehow that didn't feel like it was coming from a position of, ooh, woo, we're just small beans, also it's our birthday. It was very much, we're gritting our teeth because that's the price of supporting a stable government. And that is so annoyingly funny to me because, of course, the narrative mainstream is, oh, a left-wing coalition's terrible because Labour will just do whatever crazy thing the Greens want. But a right-wing coalition is stable because we're all united and mature, responsible government. And yet, we could not have clearer illustrations of how much it's the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much cut through this actually gets, but we must have heard Luxon and Willis say strong and stable so many times over the last week. Like, are people genuinely buying that stuff? They seem to just have it on repeat in response to every single question. Doesn't even have to be about the issue, right? They just know that they have to say strong and stable 5 times a day. And
Nothing bad ever happened to Theresa May.
exactly. I'm glad it worked out perfectly for her. And then, yeah, I mean, we've got Labour Party people saying coalition of chaos 5 times a day. And I don't care. I don't care, right? Like, is the government stable or not? What does that even mean? What are you talking about? Like, the Governor General's not bringing it down. It's not falling apart. So before that level is reached, what the hell are you talking about? Like, what is a stable government? It doesn't matter. It honestly doesn't matter, right?
It's all memes, all
Yeah.
memes.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, post that Curia Issues poll that came out really badly, showing that the headline line, Labour Party more trusted with quote unquote the economy, this made up thing, than the National Party is bad for a party that has their entire brand based on we are the economy boys. We have suits, you can see that. We wear blue because blue is the economy color, etc. Yeah, it's understandable, right? That they're getting shaky and there are kind of questions, big Q questions about Luxon's leadership. Is Chris Bishop or one of the other interminable liberals in National going to take over? So it's all kind of bubbling under the surface, but it's not a government stability question.
No, and I do have to jump in and say on Christopher Luxon, I don't want to accuse the man of playing 12D chess. I don't want to fall into that trap, but there is a bitter irony that I assume was unintended because he's not that smart, that ACT just walking all over National constantly has particularly fallen on the shoulders of Nicola Willis and Erica Stanford, the two people most often talked up as being potential challengers to Christopher Luxon. They are not in a position to say that they're going to be restoring credibility to the party or that they're going to be stronger leaders because they are clearly, I don't know what odds they're playing, but they are clearly choosing the side of it's better to stick with the current path for now than do what seems like the obvious thing, which is roll him. I mean, maybe it's a January spill, just go into the new year with a bit of momentum, but you want to get it out of the way before everyone goes off for Christmas and forgets that you had all that drama and goes into the new year going, oh shit, is it election year? Which is a thing many people who don't listen to this podcast actually do.
Ah, must be nice. What a delightful, relaxed existence that could be. Yeah, I mean, there's also kind of a perverse benefit to having a really weak pushover as a leader of a quote unquote major party when you need both minor parties, right? It's potential that if you had a leader like Chris Bishop, who might talk about policy for once in public, right? That could piss off Winston Peters pretty easily, and then maybe not get walked over so much, and then you have an unstable government that's falling apart, as opposed to a kind of trepidatious, awkward kind of dance where Luxon will just say whatever's in his mind at the time, and both minor party leaders will go, "Oh, I wouldn't do that. I would do this. And, I would go further and faster to destroy the last remaining vestiges of our institutions in order to create a fascist-leaning kind of rightward movementist organization." So we can, I think, conclude that all is well.
Strong and stable.
Strong and
Yeah, Luxon's really struggling because he can't do something like copyright the New Zealand flag or whatever. And I think, which is about all he knows how to do. And in terms of his leadership style, I think what's really interesting is like, I mean, you say, you're right. Winston Peters, who identifies as sober, is a man who is a total chameleon, right? And it's always been his thing, was he was like, oh, we're kind of a non-neoliberal, anti-woke Muldoon party, sort of. But that the meaning of that always changes no matter what. And if you speak to a New Zealand first voter who's like not clued in or not like in touch with either their feelings because they're an old cis man or politics in general, they'll oftentimes say something like, oh, he stirs the pot. I like that he gets in parliament and stirs the pot. Like the idea of agitation of politicians or some kind of revenge of politicians through the vessel of a politician, somebody who could be no more an insider than him, is kind of part of Winston Peters' appeal to these people. It's really weird. It's the kind of Donald Trump effect. Except in this case, he, didn't even pretend to be vaguely outside of systems of power beforehand. But each time he sort of rebrands himself that way. And it is interesting that he, after all of this time, has not really much of a legacy or record of anything particularly long-lasting or good. And yet people still vote for that.
it's pretty amazing, really. It's quite a historic.
I wonder if he thinks about it actually, as he's sort of circling the drain and anyway, as Winston Peters faces down inevitable mortality, I wonder if he thinks about the fact that his life has meant nothing. Yeah. Well, the curious thing about the like who is running the ship is that in this case, in some sense, there's a kind of coalition of chaos, but the kowtowing to Seymour isn't necessarily just because, you know, ACT has votes. And I think this is one of the critical things to kind of misunderstand. Is like Labour's institutional power is through unions, who will align with it no matter how insane and right wing and like horrific Labour is, right? Like it will always have the kind of arrested support of this union management. And I would like to ask the interests, from 6 years ago, how it's going, taking over that leadership, because they all just wag and circle immediately. But the Greens don't have that much. They're like NGOs, climate NGOs, who are increasingly irrelevant as people realize, well, governments around the world are going to do nothing. So in fact, it's just about who can pull the drawbridge up and, like watch more climate refugees beat against the walls while they drown in the moat. And everybody kind of turns fascist. However, if you look at the way that National and setting aside New Zealand First and ACT work, they're in many respects is kind of, oh, well, like Seymour is just a kind of avatar of capital, particularly anti-woke sort of, capital, whatever that means, and the nexus of that. And he's kind of born and bred in a test tube, in a lab, to be Mr. Little Suit debate boy, right? David Seymour doesn't mean anything except for this is a human figure representing a corporation. He's like the character Subway in Community, I guess. He's like, this guy is capital, And so therefore, the interests are in alignment with National. It's just that National's got a, it has its internecine squabbles and there are some other components to it, but very broadly, like there's nothing aberrant about sharply racist policy that turns over the kind of 1980s principles order. That Sim was totally right, arose largely out of the judiciary because of pressure from, the Māori Renaissance and actual like protest action, right? Um, there's nothing particularly repugnant to the people who own yachts in the Wynyard Quarter about this. So why would National be against it? If this is a thing which is yielding attention, votes, some sense of kind of, political, democratic, quote unquote, legitimacy to allow them to do things, I mean, what's the objection to that? There's nothing. There is no objection to it. However, I will say the kind of liberal institutionalism on which even conservatives rely, or reactionaries rely, really, to run the state. Because even a fusion of business and state, like in Nazi Germany, requires institutions that kind of work, and then eventually, when everybody goes totally nuts, it sort of falls apart when everybody's on meth, right? Only some of our prominent businessmen and judges are on meth.
Just another
yeah.
Rapid
There needs
growth.
to be some kind of stability, right?
Yeah.
And what is an issue with the Regulatory Standards Bill in particular is that pretty much every lawyer in this country has come out and been like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, I don't know how to sugarcoat this. Every little legal inside bulletin that I receive as part of my job is just like another opinion column being like, what the fuck are they thinking they're doing? Like, this as a form of like creating and generating secondary legislation, which in a way sort of trumps the primary legislation. None of this is workable or makes sense. Like, it is just complete hog slop nonsense, and might fuck up all of our statutes. So, in this sense, I think that's kind of why National's like, oh, well, it's a really great, strong, and stable bill, but also what are we doing? Like, I don't know how else to sugarcoat that. Yeah, that's the consensus, by the way. Anybody who actually has to deal with this stuff.
Mm. And that's why they had to go after lawyers and had to denigrate the role of experts and have to be like, how dare you all make submissions against this bill, which is so obviously nonsense. Because I also remember, I think it was the initial consultation on Regulatory Standards Bill was being done at the same time as submissions on the Treaty Principles Bill and a million other things last January, the time when most people are sleeping off their Christmas ham. And yet it's so egregious that we managed to get thousands and thousands and thousands of people activated to make submissions. And boy, has that scared National, because if that can be folded into an election campaign, then that's pretty bad news for them. But I think it is an important point you make, Simone, is that while I think David Seymour comes across as gauche to National people, the direction of travel is the same as their direction of travel. And they actually aren't fundamentally opposed to any of the stuff he's done. They just wish he wasn't doing it in such an obvious way that it makes them look bad. And yeah, I think the only real consequences, and this doesn't actually materially help, so it's not, saying this is a silver lining. The main thing I see is that a bunch of the more liberal slash progressive, if we want to give them that label, MPs and National, people like Nicola Willis, people like Chris Bishop, are having their feelings hurt because now people are like, don't you dare fucking show your face at Pride. Don't you dare say that you care about families or our kids. Erica Stanford, don't you dare tell us you care about education. I have a number of teachers in my extended whānau who, before the election, were like, no, she seems to, actually care and have a grasp of the issues. And now they're like, oh, whoops. And I have very politely not said, yes, I told you so. But I've thought it, and probably my face has conveyed it.
You're such
So
restraint, Stephanie.
I am so restrained. I am restrained and demure and always very strategic. But I think that is the only consequence, and it's not a consequence that's going to make them change their minds. Nicola Willis and Chris Bishop are not going to say, actually, I will give up the chance to be a cabinet minister because I care too much about upholding Te Tiriti or protecting trans people or actually giving our kids a good education. Their power is always going to come first for them. That is the fundamental issue with their ideology. And circling back, oh, it's a callback. She did it. That is why it is so bad for them to be constantly saying, we didn't want to do this, but David Seymour made us.
Yeah, 100%. And it's amazing watching them having to pin their colors to the mast, right? Once they have to choose, once any of these people have to choose between raw power and a policy platform that aligns with what they say they've been in favor of, like a lot of these people would be comfortable in a philosophical sense talking about like liberal institutional norms or whatever, right? The Willises and the bishops need like where their power comes from really relies on them being able to work with these big institutions, whether it's like the the great and the good of education or like the judiciary. These are huge like functional organs of state that need to keep moving in a like a the cogs need to keep moving for society to keep working the way that it is, as Simone says, kind of says since the 80s. And once that breaks down, then they're not really maintaining the position they've been holding up until now. But once they've been pushed into a corner, they're going to choose power every time, right? Which makes it interesting to watch from the left as the big kind of liberal institutional organs, however we want to phrase that, fail to stand up against pretty naked kind of reactionary attacks, right? And there have been like legal cases and challenges, and as Simone says, there's pushback from these organizations, but that doesn't mean we can sit back and go, oh, good, the judiciary have got this in hand. I think they'll stand up fine against reactionary turn, and the same for education and the same for finance, right? Like there was that opinion poll of popularity of politicians, and whilst David Seymour is like a naked avatar for capital, it's not like they like him as a person, right? Big business end of town think he's this kind of grubby little nerd, but that doesn't matter. Like that's who you are. You don't like him because he is you. There's quite a nasty kind of psychological element to that.
He's not Don Draper. He doesn't make them feel cool.
Yeah, exactly. He's very uncool.
Yes.
Exactly, exactly. And it shows them that they're not cool. And that's not nice for anyone, right? But yeah, they hate him whilst giving him power and, enforcing all of his actual kind of attacks on their hold on institutional forces. Simone, did you want to bring in the case that we were talking about just before? Because I think this is a great example of that.
Yeah, I mean, first I wanted to touch on something briefly that Stephanie had said about the judges and about lawyers. And I think that this is sort of instructive, is that it's not just the kind of liberal institutional component. It's also, I mean, if you think about it, Seymour sort of plays a shell game with democratic mandate always, right? And then he gets away with it because the press eats out of his hand for a lot of reasons, which we've covered many times on the show. With those submissions, because of course everybody knows that Select Committee is sort of one of those innovations of New Zealand parliamentary politics, which is meant to be like, look, we're more democratic than the UK or whatever it is, which is such a high bar to clear, as we know.
Very difficult, very high.
It's so hard. How can you beat a Westminster system like that? Anyway, much like MMP, it's also one of those things where it's like we're kind of European with it. Everybody loves the Scandinavian welfare state. We're not allowed that part. But it's kind of interesting that he plays this shell game. I mean, you think about like with the Regulatory Standards Bill, with the Treaty Principles Bill, the overwhelming public opposition to that, and Seymour saying, "Oh, they're all just copying each other. They're all brainwashed. It's all cut and paste," And then you look at, and the Regulatory Standards Bill was the same, but then you look at like the reintroduction of three strike sentencing, and something like I'm not sure the exact number. I think it was something like 80% of the submissions were copy-paste sensible sentencing trust ones. And Seymour looked at that and he came out and said, look how much public support there is for taking these crims out the back and shooting them in the back of the head. You know, it's kind of unreal that he gets away with doing that. But this is exactly how it works, right? How he has to sort of play a shell game with democratic mandate by doing this really clever thing that we in the business called lying.
It's an innovation.
And the reason why he talks about activist judges is because, in some sense, like, for better or for worse, I think New Zealand's judiciary, and except for like a few really racist KCs, is by and large, in the American sense, really liberal. Like, there are no leftists. All of the leftist lawyers are like compromised by being lawyers, which I will put my hand up and say, yeah, me too. Like, all lawyers are bastards, right? There's no getting around this. You get infected with lawyer brain, and then you have to like go somewhere else to retouch grass again and not be around psycho people. Even if you're like a public defender. However, they're very liberal, very institutionalist, very much like, yes, human rights are important. And this is not particularly true in our criminal law. It hasn't been for some time. But in most spheres of our law, including how contract law is meant to operate smoothly and how the operation of business goes, there has to be some kind of reality to it, right? Like there has to be some sense in which you have to make this trade or these social relations between the different kind of components of capital, between capital and labor, between worker and employee. They have to, employer and employee, they have to work, right? Realistically, they have to sort of actually operate. This is why Seymour has been attacking the judges, because the fast track bill has seen a lot of challenges to its decisions because they are all justiciable. They're all ones where you can go and say, well, the government's making this decision, so we can judicially review it. Has it made this decision appropriately? And so many of these fast track permits have been gummed up in the courts and challenged because that's part of our constitutional makeup. You're able to do that. This is why we're seeing an attack. And I think this judge, in the case of Her Honor that we're talking about, Judge Aitken, Emma Aitken, is because of Winston Peters, who just has a kind of personal bully syndrome. And that's the real reason why for him. So what happened was, and there are a couple of different factual versions of events, this judge, Emma Aitken, had been at one of those, I think it was one of those Auckland
Northern Club.
country club type places, the Northern Club, maybe it was.
It's pretty renowned in Auckland as, I'm not saying you should do this, but if you were going to stand outside a club and wait for all the worst people in Auckland to file out in a very targetable single file, I can't think of anywhere better in Auckland to kind of post up. Don't do
So
that.
she's not at like, Her Honor is not at some lefty kind of like Green Party event or like, the Trotskyists of Remuera or something like that, She's
No,
at
it's all the
the Northern
reactionaries.
Club at like an end of year function last year. And then there was also a New Zealand first organized private business dinner, because again, this is how it works in this country. Everything happens in these rooms, smoky rooms with men who chomp cigars. Like, the vote is kind of just one component that doesn't really matter because you're being directed as to who to vote for anyway. In any case, the New Zealand First Party Secretary claims that she had overheard this, that Judge Aitken was going to the bathroom. On the way back to Her Honour's function in a different room, Winston Peters was saying something about how they are forcing tikanga to override the Westminster system of New Zealand government. And this is what all of the, judiciary is doing and these damned lawyers and all that sort of thing. And her version of events is that she said to a speaker, that's not true. And one of the things she said was very quiet, and the other one was louder, like its speaking volume, was, no, that's nonsense. This is not true. What the New Zealand First Party Secretary says is that Judge Aitken said louder than speaking, like you could say, yelling, oh, he's lying. And that this is a breach of constitutional norms so severe that a panel must consider whether or not Her Honour must be removed from the bench. And this is going through a full hearing process.
Gobsmacked.
Yeah, this is in her private capacity, not as a judge. This might surprise you that this is something which can be done given all of the like comments which many of our public figures make about other branches of government. Like, why is Winston Peters not removed for lying about how our judiciary works? Why is this not something where he has to face a panel? Very interesting. So, what's curious about it to me is that the story has developed because the panel has convened. However, they haven't had their substantive hearing to discover what the facts are, because there are two components to every kind of legal hearing, right? There is what is the legal position, and much of the time this is settled. But lawyers will make submissions on it because they'll want to draw the judge's attention to, well, this part of the law is better for us, and therefore we want to highlight it. And the other lawyer says, no, 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 it's this part of the law. Until you get to the appellate courts, in which case you're arguing about what the law ought to be. In this case, there is that component here. There's also the kind of factual component, like what happened. And this is what most people are familiar with in criminal trials, right? A jury is the finder of fact. The judge doesn't find the fact. The judge will direct the jury as to what the law is, oh, this is the position in New Zealand law. And so given those constraints and given those elements of the offense, you have to decide whether or not this happened or whether or not it met the criteria. And what happened? In this case, the panel is doing both. This is normal. It's not, you're not going to have a jury for this sort of thing. It's rather specialist. It's interesting to dive into the panel members, but I won't do that here. However, in this case, Judge Aitken is, in my view, and not those of anybody else, including my employer, being denied natural justice. And if a judge is being denied natural justice, this says horrific things for us, because it is extraordinarily dangerous if even one of the most preeminent members of the community is not able to obtain one of the most fundamental principles of natural justice when facing any sort of charge in any kind of tribunal or court or panel, which is you need to know what the charges against you are, you need to know what the legal test that's being met by the facts is, and you need to be able to make submissions on that. Now, Her Honour tried to appeal to the High Court about some of the components about how the panel was running this, saying, I'm flying blind. I haven't been told what the legal test is. Like, what do I need to have said for it to have breached my position as a judge? And the High Court said, no, we don't think this is justiciable. I can't recall the exact decision. And the panel has now come back and said, well, in fact, we're not going to tell you. We're not going to tell you what you should submit on. You're not allowed to know. You're not allowed to know what the legal test is that you're being held to, actually. And the reason this is concerning is because once the finding of fact is made, then the panel can say this is what the legal test is, thereby retroactively deciding if it met it or not. And this is what we in the business like to call rat fucking. It's a very specific term of art in the law.
Technical.
Yeah, it's very technical. This is sort of obviously concerning on its face, right? Like, if you don't know what it is that constitutes what you're supposed to have been breaching, how can you possibly make submission on it? And how can you direct your case theory toward it? You can't. The fact that this is being denied to a judge is deeply concerning to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good, thanks for breaking it down to that level, because I think it's been one of those stories that's kind of slipped under the radar of a lot of people because it looks more surface level. It's like one individual. It's just, Winston Peters and one of his many kind of tiffs that he has, and all these kind of surface level kind of legal threats that he throws around every year. But you're right, just, relate that on a personal level to imagine that you're being charged with something you haven't, proven yet whether you did it or not, but also you don't know what the problem was, right? As you say.
Yes. Sorry, I was just going to go into the particulars. In this case, and this is really important, Judge Aitken had asked, what is the construction of knowledge or intent that I needed to have had? Or rather, the legal team, Her Honour's legal team has asked, what is the construction of knowledge and intent that needed to have been had for this to have been an inappropriate thing? If I was just saying it, for example, to, my colleague at the table and other people overheard it, that's intended to be a private comment. I'm not trying to make some kind of protest about this. Yes, that's sort of obvious on its face. And there was an ask by her team for clarity on the particulars, and it was these two things. They had two questions. They said, we want to know what is the test for how Judge Aitken's alleged behavior breached the constitutional obligation. Pretty fair. Number two, what is the standard for the gravity of it, how serious it was, as to warrant consideration for removal, right? And can we have examples of this as something that might assist when you make submissions, written submissions, and also oral submissions? The court came back, the panel, sorry, came back and said, no, we don't need to give you clarity about this, actually.
Yeah, wild,
They
right?
said at the substantive hearing, the judge will have the opportunity to test the evidence presented by special counsel, call the evidence she wishes to call in response to that evidence, to make submissions on the facts and law. Nothing further is required at this stage. One really basic problem with this: how the fuck do you get the evidence to present if you don't know what you're supposed to be presenting it for? How do you prep your witnesses? How do you prep your questions? How do you prep fucking anything about this if you don't know? This is a kangaroo court. It is a secret court, right? This is essentially a this is an example of one of those things that you will see in history books, and also present day books. If you look at like the national security courts in the United States, about like secret tribunals, and it's hard not to see that there isn't a pre-made outcome for this. There might not be, but the fact that this is being done and being reported on itself has a chilling effect. And the reason for that is not only because a judge can't get natural justice, so what hope do you have? It's that what is alleged to have happened, even if she had said, oh, he's lying out loud at in front of a private business dinner, not in front of the general public, is that a judge was telling the truth about what a politician was saying in her domain of expertise. Winston Peters was lying. You are not allowed to say the emperor is lying. Apparently, this is it is potentially a constitutional breach. You have to be dragged and hauled in front of a panel, embarrassed on the national stage in front of every lawyer in this country for this, and not allowed to defend yourself.
Yeah.
That has a chilling effect.
Incredible. I mean, you can expand that to other domains, right? But if you're someone with expertise now watching this, what are you meant to think, right? When are you allowed to give voice to your opinion on something that, as you say, like no better person, a judge is the person who is more likely to know about this than fucking Winston Raymond Peters. And if she's going to be hauled up and
Everybody loves Winston Raymond Peters.
WRP.
And if you can't even say something to a colleague at one of the most prestigious private clubs in the freaking country, well, then when can you?
Yeah.
The thing is, and I mean, this is just me not being a lawyer and mainly having a comms brain. The thing for me looking at all the public reporting of this so far, which does not go into any amount of level of depth that Simone's just gone through, and that's why you should keep listening to One of 200 and maybe check out the Patreon, is that all the reporting is just like, she shouted that Winston was lying, and not even the baseline follow-up of what was she responding to. If she did, what was she responding to? Was it accurate? Because people's perception of whether it was appropriate is going to be wildly different depending on whether he was lying about how our judicial system works or whether he was just saying, actually, I prefer the pavlova over the lemon sponge at the frickin' Northern Club buffet. It's just such an obvious next question. How could you possibly publish anything on this without at least checking that one level of detail to inform the shape of the story? And for all of the coverage on freaking Radio New Zealand, to not have any of this level of detail is just like complete failure of the role of the media in this, on top of a complete failure of the judiciary, on top of a senior politician is trying to run a woman out of the judiciary because in a private conversation she said, yeah, that's not fucking true. Hello, democracy. Are the red flags going up yet? I'm not sure. I can't see them. They're too big.
I'm trying to imagine a counterfactual where, like, suppose that this were Juliet Moses, who were at the Northern Club. Why would Juliet Moses be at a White Citizens Council? I don't know, but it
Mystery.
happens. And Winston Peters is up there and says, the Jews have space lasers where they're circumcising your babies from orbit. And Juliet Moses says, that's crazy. You're lying. Not even you're an anti-Semite. You're lying, right? and then she faces disciplinary action as a lawyer at, I think it's TGT Legal, if anybody wanted to know. Then suppose that were to happen, I think it would be clearly obvious on its face that everybody would say, well, no, this is, something where it's in the right. Like, this is, the head of the, like, Israel sucking dick club, right? She's able to recognize this sort of thing or say it. The problem probably is that, if somebody's an ally, they're allowed to get away with whatever. Like, the ADL isn't against, like, Nazi salutes so long as you're an Israel supporter, right? But they love to conflate those sorts of things, like Judaism itself in Israel, right? So, in some sense, she would feel protective about this. Suppose that were to happen, the reporting would be totally different. We would understand this immediately. The reason why is because there there isn't a level anti-institutional racism against one sort of area, but there is anti-Maori racism is normal. It is part of the fabric of this country. It's not inappropriate. It's more inappropriate to call out anti-Maori racism than it is to say it.
Mm. Even and maybe particularly in a space like that, right? Which,
At the White Citizens Council.
yeah.
And I can't help but I've played too many role-playing games, guys. I can't imagine that this isn't going to involve at some point someone saying, well, the room was noisy, so technically the level she had to speak at in order to be heard by the person across the table was shouting. That means she did shout, and it wasn't a normal conversational level because they were in a crowded northern club with a whole lot of drunk businessmen. It just feels like it's going to be that level of, and can I congratulate us all for not bringing this word into the conversation until this point, Kafka-esque.
It's been a trial just not bringing it into the conversation.
Boom, boom!
Sorry.
Kafka, I hardly knew her.
Yeah, horrible, 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 horrible. But look, this is the kind of like institutional assault on institutions, I should say. An instance of that we were talking about in the first half, right? This is all one story today. Sorry for being boring. Because we've seen a similar thing with also deeply anti-Māori racist overtones in the changes to curriculum, and hence the pushback from the good people in schools who were signing up to a list online to commit to follow through on still abiding by Te Tiriti guidelines. I don't know how you want to phrase that, philosophy. But that's been quite interesting as well, because that's been treated as bullying in the same way by Erica Stanford, right? Saying that it's horrific, it's so nasty to explain, to say you have principles out loud.
And also, can we talk about the strategic blunder? Because the current Facebook post going around of a national MP complaining about bullying happening in a school context is from Sam Uffindell.
Mr. Bedleg himself.
You don't have any other members of caucus who might want to have taken the point on that one, guys?
Pros.
This is just such I know, pointing out the hypocrisy doesn't matter, but it is such a glaring example of the double standards that this government will apply, because a whole bunch of schools just saying, look, we're going to continue to acknowledge the founding document of this nation. And honestly, I don't know how long the guidelines have been in place, but it feels like one of those things where it's probably more of a hassle to take the tikanga out of your processes at this point than it is to just keep doing what you were doing anyway. But that apparently is bullying and harassment when schools are just like, yeah, gonna keep doing it. But it's not when David Seymour is posting individual academics' faces on his Facebook page every day, basically calling them enemies of the people for not supporting the bill, which now National would totally repeal if they were given the chance. It's just the way that when they do it, it's not bullying. But if people do it to say we disagree with you, it is. And it's such an egregious double standard. I've used the word egregious twice. God, what am I doing this weekend? That it really highlights how much I think this decision was a blunder by Stanford. And again, probably driven by ACT or New Zealand First, because it doesn't appear that she's allowed to do any of her own ideas in the portfolio. It's been so loud and I think so unexpected, because it's not the teacher unions, despite what Sam Uffindell says, it's not the unions doing this, it is not the radical lefties, it's school board of trustees. Groups who are often can be relied on to be pretty conservative or inactive, or at least just not wanting to take political stances on things. And now we have like over 57% of schools' boards of trustees going, yeah, no, we're going to keep doing this. What are you talking about? It must have come as a shock because they probably thought this was one they could dog whistle. Haha, we're taking all that woke modification out of the education system. And then it turns out everyone was just like, what are you talking about? This is fine and normal. This is really a were you listening too much to ZB talkback callers and angry Facebook boomers and didn't actually remember that there are a lot of people who support Te Tiriti who are parents and teachers and on school board of trustees and active members in their community. It just feels like a real breakdown of that psychological. They've been dismissing all the opposition to them as woke radicals who aren't in touch with real people and have forgotten that actually all of us are real people who have lives and communities that we exist in and can be active in. And whoops, turns out that the dog whistle just summoned the wrong dogs? Where am I going with this metaphor? I don't know.
Well, the silent majority isn't who they thought it was, right? That's the problem. Like, yeah, they've been captured internally by people who are so much more reactionary than the average, that they don't have a realistic understanding of where the electorate is, right? Gross term, I'm so sorry. I try to avoid that. But yeah, it feels like it's a swing and a miss electorally, politically, but even as an attempted assault on a more, I guess, shall we say, progressive part of our like institutional structure, it isn't working because the people aren't with them, right? They need a different concerted approach to do this. And the fact that it's Erica Stanford being, having her face put on the money for this one is quite funny, given that she's kind of the choice of the more liberal-ish half of National, and a lot of their supporters heard like a more competent, detail-oriented leader, perhaps the Matthew Hootons of the operating world would love her to take over, right? But the fact that she's having to, I keep saying having to, she's not having to do shit, right? She's a very powerful person. She doesn't have to be doing any of this. She's made the choice that we were talking about, where she's chosen power at the expense of truth or standing up for what she says she believes in, or at the expense of the values that she would have endorsed before she got into power, right? And it's great that she's having to do this because it's pinned her colours to the mast, right? We can see who she is. And now when she does run for the leader of the National Party, there's a trail of bodies through the education sector that we can all point at and go, that's who you want? You want the person who overrode the will of the vast majority of schools in this country, who had to actively go out of their way on behalf of parents and teachers and every part of the educational sector to push back and say that's not what any of these people want. That's not how any of this works, right? And now when National runs and says, oh, we're going to do this and do that, whatever it is, whatever their educational plan will be, there's no reason to believe that it won't be at the expense of some radical minor party agenda next time.
I really liked how she also followed in David Seymour's footsteps of getting absolutely punked at a school visit because some kids sang a song she didn't like and it was very upsetting. And then she suddenly had to backpedal into this. Oh, but it's actually fine if schools continue to give effect to Te Waitangi. We're just giving them the choice. It was all about giving them the choice. And it's just so obviously not what you were trying to do, Erica. I'm sorry.
Yeah, isn't it great that people now have the choice to make the effort to go back to doing things the way they were doing just before you came and stomped all through their yard with your racist boots, your racism boots. Yeah, but and in a similar way that like the great unwashed or the whatever, the silent majority isn't who National thinks they are or hopes they are. I'm sure we're expecting the Free Speech Union to come loudly to the defense of teachers and schools who are saying what they want to teach, and lists online, nasty, scary lists online. The name of a school in a spreadsheet. I'm quaking in my boots. And then also we have judges being attacked and in basically secret tribunals, as Simone was saying. That is a wild example. Yeah, and it feels like a pretty concerted, messy, but concerted kind of set of assaults on the system that we have in this country with a nasty, like, incoherent and stupid and hypocritical, but when is it not all those things, kind of fascist leaning on the part of many people in our government. And I, for one, am against it, and I'm not afraid to admit it.
Brave.
Bravely, yeah,
Brave.
bravely
And
setting out the anti-fascist stall.
and look, we can also take heart in the fact that they're also going to make it much harder for you to enroll to vote at the next election. So good news, fewer people's votes will be counted as this government bravely stands before the New Zealand public and says, please endorse all the things that David Seymour made us do.
And I mean, this is partly the problem, right? Is that if you're on the left and you think, and you already probably had a pretty critical analysis of these kind of liberal organs of state that we've been talking about since, we started this podcast. But since the 80s, I think most people in New Zealand would agree that we're not exactly a big state socialist utopia when it comes to human rights, right? We're a very lean, nasty, neoliberal, racist organization, society as is. So the temptation, I think, especially if you're liberal or on the left, when we see these assaults on institutions, is to defend the institution kind of as is, right? That's what we see in the States a lot when the Republicans attack big, organizational structures or talk about activist judges, as Simone was saying, right? It's easy for the Democrats, or if you're a more kind of reactionary, reacting to that as a leftist, it's quite easy to say, well, don't attack. Like, this is a bad attack on the judges. But I think we need to be a bit smarter here about it because these people aren't on our side, right? As someone was saying, like these kind of liberal organs of state, they're not, we need them to maintain the trajectory of the country that we're currently going on. But the trajectory we're on isn't the one we want, right? We need to have a bigger and more progressive understanding of what the country can be, right? And that doesn't mean, because in this case, teachers and workers in the educational sector as a whole and parents mostly have got this push against what the government's doing. That doesn't mean that in the next instance we shouldn't change the entire structure of that organism, right? Because it's not on our side, and it's a difficult dance you have to do as a leftist to constantly critique and work to improve a system that's being brutally attacked by a side that's much worse and reactionary and frankly disgusting in its own ways, to quote Erica Stanford. And it's hard, right? And I think we need to be smarter about the way that we defend, quote unquote, defend institutions on the left in general without endorsing them or giving them the excuse to say that they're standing up to the bullies.
So as with the case of Judge Emma Aitken, as Simone outlined, yeah, we need to be talking loudly about how the government is clearly exerting political pressure on the judiciary. That doesn't mean the justice system doesn't need some serious reforms, because everyone should actually have access to that natural justice, which is being denied to a judge in this case. It's an extreme example of a problem that is pervasive in the justice system and in our political system. So yeah, it's always that yes and not falling into the trap of endorsing the status quo, because the status quo is messed up and we need radical transformation of it. And pointing out its current flaws and hypocrisies might be a way to get people on board with that. So let's do that instead of, I'm not saying this at any particular major political party leader, but you know who I mean, instead of acting like everything would be fine if we just stopped this current government doing the extra bad things.
Yeah, yeah. It's the issue with the low target strategy thing as well, right? Which we've talked about before, is that if you don't have a vision to replace the status quo, then you are the status quo, right? So yeah, the problem with emphasizing these attacks on institutions and norms, if you're one of those people, is you end up endorsing those things kind of by default. But we need a constant like re-emphasizing of the imagination required to build something that actually works for humans, which would be great, wouldn't it? Imagine if we all had natural justice as good as a judge who's currently being, dragged through a secret tribunal.
And if I
Delightful.
could if I could just do my Stephanie jumps to the bigger picture over all of this, one of the things, if we consider how we had a certain government in 2017 to 2020, and then we had a certain government 2020 to 23, and then, oh, look, the wheels fell off. If you have a genuine transformative vision to change the status quo in a radical, and I mean that in the fancy Latin at the roots way, then you don't run out of ideas in your second and third term, because the ideas you take into your first term are the start. They are not the finish, they are not the end. You have a 10, 20-year idea of how you're going to change this country. You're not going to run out of ideas, and you shouldn't be selling your first term policies as this is what's going to fix everything. You should be selling it as we are resetting the foundations of our country so it actually ensures everyone can live a decent life. And gonna be honest, I'm gonna pull one of those Pod Save America bullshit takes where I'm like, when I was working in Parliament, when working in Jan Logie's office, we got some really significant budget packages across the line for the family violence and sexual violence sectors. We were always real clear that's not fixing it. This is not a 1 year, 3 year, 6 year fix for the sector, which is under so much demand and has been so underfunded for so long. We need to have the narrative from day one. Hoorah! Huge funding increases to a lot of those agencies that are doing it really tough, but got to keep pushing because you're going to be answering the question next term. Well, why are you getting another 100 million? Why are you getting another scheme stood up? Why are you setting up another program? Because the work demands that we keep going. And that is a way to give momentum to your government and to your vision for the country, is to remember that we're not just reversing the last 3 years of bullshit. We want something better than we had 3 years ago.
Yeah, and that's often the issue with this would be too much of a tangent to discuss in detail, but that's often the issue with not just Labour but opposition spokespeople in general saying this government has made cuts to X or has gone back to levels we were at in the 2000s or the 90s or whatever, right? When really you need to be comparing that against what's needed as opposed to what was, right? Were you happy with the way the health system functioned in the 2000s? I sure wasn't. So yeah, it's a little disingenuous to say this government has, cut funding to something since to the levels it was, blah blah blah. When you should be saying what I wanted then was this, and this is what's required, a much more radical kind of recreation of potential futures. But then Chris Hipkins wept for he had no more policies to bonfire.
And I promise I'll be quick. It also ignores the fact that where we were 3 years ago wasn't good enough, but also things have gotten worse since then. So we can't just reset to 3 years ago because we've also got to play catch up with all of the damage done by this government. So you can't just pick a point in the past and say that was the good point, and if we just reverse everything it'll be fine, because you've also got the rot of our civic structures and our welfare state is compounding upon itself. I don't know if rot compounds, I'm not a scientist, but yeah, having more to offer people than hitting the reset button and we'll just pretend that Christopher Luxon never happened, as marvelous as that would be to do.
Yeah, when you have a society where you have these kind of bullying standover tactics by the government against institutions and individuals, and any kind of roadblock to their theory of power, then probably we need to do something a little more substantial than give all those people being attacked a lollipop and say, let's stop.
And can I just get one more dig in at Sam Uffindell? This whole thing, it's not just him. Tim Costley's done the same thing. I'm hearing from my local schools that they're being bullied. You're a government MP. Why are you not supporting these poor, vulnerable institutions in your communities to speak up for themselves? Why are you just like, wow, it sucks that you're afraid, man. I'm going to post about that on Facebook. You have power. You sit in a meeting room with the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister and most of the cabinet every week at caucus, and you're powerless to help these schools in your communities. Wow, sounds like you're not good at your job, bro.
Both, yeah, both powerful enough to make change and not powerful enough to help. Right. The perfect position for a leader to be in. Okay, that we should wrap up on. Simone, can we get some final thoughts from one of New Zealand's most incisive legal minds?
Are they here in
Yeah,
the room with us?
just behind you. Yeah.
No final thoughts. I gave all my thoughts. It's
No
okay.
thoughts, thought free.
Hit empty. It's Saturday.
Get empty, moisturized in your lane. Stephanie, what about from one of New Zealand's premier communications experts?
I think she's having a nap right now. My only final thought, and it's just a shameless plug, is that Tamitha Paul has dropped some sick as fuck campaign merch. So you'll need to go to tamithapaul.nz and buy some sweet prints and Metallica themed t-shirts.
Oh, very cool. They look very awesome. Thank you, everyone. That's been another week of One of 200, the best podcast, some are saying, in the world. Thank you very much. We enjoy you listening to our takes almost as much as you enjoy listening to our beautiful, soothing voices, our gravelly tones. We appreciate all your help. Go to our website, drop us $1 in the Patreon bucket if you're feeling generous and if you have any money left over after donating to all the worthy causes out there. Have an amazing week. Enjoy the sun, touch grass, and we'll catch you next time.
If artificers are then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's apart now. It's paved with good intentions. And I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day. This vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're on the road to hell.